He was big, but he fit perfectly in my hand, causing such a strangely pleasant sensation that I almost completely forgot where I was and who it was. I was very young. I didn't really know what it meant, but the priest said it was to free me from sins and purify me from everything bad. At first, it hurt a lot, but then I got used to it, even though I didn't like it.
In medieval Europe, many young women made the decision to enter a convent, although most had no idea what truly awaited them behind those stone walls. Had they known the duties associated with this life, such as greeting village visitors with a forced smile or accepting unusual tasks, they would likely have reconsidered this path of service to the Lord. In the Middle Ages, entering a monastery was less of a choice than an imposition of circumstance. Young women unable to marry, often due to a lack of dowry or political convenience, were relegated to this option. Without marriage, they could not inherit property, leaving them without resources or a guaranteed future. The convent, though imperfect, was seen as a refuge from a life marked by epidemics, endless wars, and widespread scarcity. A popular belief held that only virgins could enter the convent, and tests were conducted to confirm their purity. However, at a time when medicine was rudimentary and verification methods were limited, these examinations were nothing but a myth. What was undeniable was that nuns had to commit to leading a chaste and pure life, keeping themselves away from any relationship with men. By taking their vows, they were regarded as brides of Christ, a symbolic title reminding them of their duty to resist human temptations. The daily life of a nun was designed to minimize any sinful thoughts. Their day began at dawn with long hours of prayer. Afterward, they dedicated themselves to domestic tasks, working in the gardens or welcoming visitors. As night fell, physical and mental exhaustion left them with no energy for anything other than rest. The clothing they wore also played a crucial role in this control. The garments, heavy and closed, were not only a symbol of modesty, but also a tool to protect them from worldly gazes and thoughts, both their own and those of the priests. However, adhering to the vow of chastity was not an easy task. During extended periods of abstinence, some nuns resorted to extreme measures such as bathing in icy water during the winter, hoping to dispel bodily impulses. This method, though effective at the time, often led to serious illnesses, especially among the younger ones whose health was already fragile. Despite the strict rules, not all monasteries maintained the purity they preached. Some, like the English monastery of Lyle's Hall, became places where the norms were frequently violated. There, the young religious women were ignored, and visits from villagers, often drunk, were common. What's curious is that these visits were not free. Villagers paid to speak with a nun, and the price varied depending on her appearance. The novices, young recruits still shy, were the most sought after, particularly by wealthy visitors who preferred their innocence. Over time, the novices learned to manage these interactions, and their first conversations brought in much more than the later ones. More experienced nuns, on the other hand, received the villagers for a modest fee. Strangely, the villagers seemed to have a preference for the more plump nuns from modest families. Meanwhile, wine flowed freely in the monastery, and songs echoed late into the night. When villagers were no longer enough, the nuns did not hesitate to attract passing travellers. These visitors, unfamiliar with the local dynamics, were forced to pay for accommodation, and in some cases were stripped of a few belongings. Not being part of the community, they had no way of returning with reinforcements, making them easy prey for the increasingly worldly needs of the convent. In most cases, the absolute authority within a monastery rested on the figure of the abbess. Not only did she exert strict control, but her severity was often encouraged by the very structure of the convent. The nuns, under her authority, could be physically punished for minor offences, or in the most severe cases, be locked in their cells for an indefinite period. Historical documents reveal that, in some monasteries, young women were forced to perform hard labour, leading to such intense physical exhaustion that premature deaths, especially among the younger ones, were alarming. It is disturbing to discover that these deaths were not always accidental. Further research suggested that the youngest were deliberately chosen for specific tasks due to the preference of wealthy men to interact with them. This not only increased the flow of visitors to the monastery, but sometimes children were born behind the convent walls. Although rumours about these practices occasionally reached the ecclesiastical authorities, attempts at effective control remained largely unsuccessful. In some extreme cases, guards were assigned to monitor the monastery walls, or even to imprison rebellious abbesses within their own convent. However, these measures only addressed the symptoms, leaving the roots of the problem intact. Some monasteries even operated as clandestine human trafficking centres, selling young, attractive women as slaves to foreign merchants. To conceal these activities, they falsified records, registering fictitious deaths with carefully manipulated dates. In other cases, young women were confined in the convent solely to satisfy the desires of wealthy men who paid generously for their entertainment. Surprisingly, this behaviour was not limited to external visitors. In many monasteries, the abbesses themselves openly cohabited with priests, defying both the ecclesiastical rules and the moral principles they claimed to uphold. History even reports cases where an abbess gave birth to a child, raised within the convent with the participation of the entire community. When questions arose, the justification was always the same. Everyone, the world, is entitled to make mistakes, and God, in His infinite mercy, always forgives after confession. These incidents were not rare in medieval Europe. Not only did villagers frequently visit monasteries, but members of the higher clergy also joined in these forbidden interactions. Births within convents were more common than the church was willing to admit, and no one was surprised to find human remains quietly buried in the grounds of monasteries. Why did monasteries hold such an attraction for men? Perhaps because behind the walls, the nuns enjoyed a freedom rarely granted to women of the time.
Social restrictions seemed to fade within the convents, and the young women knew how to comfort and charm the men who, in conversing with them, momentarily forgot their responsibilities and desired to return. Ecclesiastical authorities were not unaware of this behavior. They knew that the transgressions of some monasteries severely weakened the reputation of the church and called into question the spiritual values they claimed to uphold. Despite efforts to correct these behaviors through endless days of prayer, severe physical punishments, or prolonged isolation in cells, the violations continued, perpetuating an endless cycle of sin, penance, and repetition. Over time, some began to wonder if the strict rules of celibacy were partly responsible for these behaviors. Would life in monasteries have been more peaceful and stable if monks and nuns had been allowed to start families? Without the restrictions that heightened natural desires, perhaps the convents could have evolved into spaces of true spirituality, where harmony and tranquility prevailed. It is difficult to know for certain, but it is likely that many of these tragedies and scandals could have been avoided with a more humane and flexible approach to monastic life.